Hey everybody, this is Gabe Hernandez with Comical Opinions. I wanted to talk about this article interview with Jim Lee from DC Comics that came out from Hollywood Reporter last week, and this has been sort of analyzed to death by this point. It's been out for about 4 days as of the time of this recording. I want to talk about this a little bit, but I also want to talk more specifically about an opinion piece that came out from ICV2 today and its analysis. So essentially, this video is a reaction to a reaction. I wanted to talk a bit about it, and I think there's some different interpretations of what Jim Lee is saying and what was really going on behind the scenes with DC Comics as far as how they got to the point where they had to do essentially a layoff of about a third of their staff last Monday, and how they got to that point. And so you hear a lot of chatter on Twitter about, well, AT&T is this big, faceless, mindless, soulless mega corporation, and they don't care about comics, and they just want to hack slash and just use it as an IP farm. Okay, we can go with that a little bit. They are in massive debt. They're looking to squeeze out every last penny they can. We can go with that a little bit, but it's not quite that simple. And then when we dig further, we see that AT&T buying Warner Media, which owns DC Comics, they have their own financial woes. They have their own profit objectives that they have to deal with, and you could say the same thing. They're another big, soulless, mindless, faceless mega corporation, and they're just interested in IPs and how many toys they can sell and how many movies they can make, on and on and on and on. And to a certain degree, that's fair, and I think we can go with that a little bit more. But there's a key element that I think a lot of these conversations tend to leave out, that they tend to kind of gloss over a little bit. And Jim Lee's interview from the Hollywood Reporter bears that piece of information out, bears out that one little key that makes all the difference in the world. And we're going to talk about it a little bit. So in this Heat Vision interview that came out on August 14th from the Hollywood Reporter, they're basically going through the litany of questions that you expect to level at somebody who's in a position of authority when a company goes through a major layoff or reorganization, which is definitely the case for DC Comics. And the one piece of information that has kind of got everybody keenly interested in what Jim had to say is this little snippet right down here in the article. When asked about whether or not DC Comics is still publishing comics, which of course they are, and Jim Lee is putting on the brave face to the general public, he says, of course, we're still doing comics. Comics are key to what DC Comics does, and it's key to what needs to be done for Warner Media. But then he throws in this little very interesting tidbit of information. And the quote is this: "That said, we will be reducing the size of the slate, but it's about looking at everything and looking at the bottom 20 to 25% of the line that wasn't breaking even or was losing money." Now, that's the key piece of information that a lot of people tend to forget when they're talking about the big, nameless, faceless, soulless corporations and their interest in hacking and slashing away and just extracting the IP information to do movies and toys and whatnot. It's, you have a company, which is DC Comics. They have a product line. The product line are their individual titles, everything from Aquaman to the Justice League to the Suicide Squad to everything in between. Each individual title is a product. Their complete lineup of titles is their inventory of product, their product line. What he's saying here, if I be maybe so bold to reinterpret, is Jim Lee is saying that up to a quarter was either not making money or outright losing money for the entire business of DC Comics. That's huge. That's a huge bit of information. If you have any company, let's take DC Comics aside for a second and the uniqueness of who they are and what they do. You take any company that exists out there, a chemical company, a pharmaceutical company, auto part company, any company that you can think of. And if a quarter of the stuff that they make is either not breaking even or outright losing money, that business won't survive. It just won't. So that means that not only were they producing books and then shipping them to retailers, local comic book shops, or endpoints wherever they may exist, and they weren't making back the money that they had invested in making those books in the first place, but to maintain their revenue stream, that means the books that were making money, the top end books, the Batmans, the Supermans, whatever book happens to be on the top of the list for that particular month, the profit you would have made off those books is now being basically pulled back in to fill the gaps and to subsidize the books that have lost money. How long has this been going on? I couldn't tell you. Is that good? No, it's awful. So not only, and you can't look at that each individual title in and of itself and say, well, Batman was profitable that month. It sort of doesn't matter, because when you have a large corporation like Warner Media or AT&T, they're saying, let me look at all your numbers in aggregate. Let me look at all your titles together as a collective collective product line. And so when a quarter of that product line is losing money, and basically for the business to keep running as a whole, DC Comics publisher to run as a whole, part of the profits from the books that were profitable are going back to basically offset the losses from the losing books, you get into a really stagnant position. You get into a situation where essentially you can see very easily how DC Comics as a whole is not making money. Well, Batman was profitable that month. It kind of doesn't matter, because if you have 4 or 5 or 6 titles that were losing money, all the profits you would have made on Batman now have gotten soaked up into offsetting the cost for the books that lost money. Now he's saying 20 to 25% of the line wasn't breaking even or was losing money. He's playing with words a little bit. Not breaking even, losing money are really kind of the same thing. And so then if you add in the books that were just breaking even or making a profit margin that's so thin, it's a rounding error, the number of the percentage of number of titles that fall into that category now becomes potentially higher. Not great. So that's where we are with this article. That's the one key piece of information that makes the most sense as far as understanding how DC Comics got into the position it's in with Warner Media and AT&T, because every large corporation, when there's a merger and acquisition, as what's happened here with AT&T, they look at every business unit, who's profitable, who's not, and the business units that aren't profitable, they either are going to be jettisoned, sold off, or they're going to have to be cut. And that's what happened in DC Comics situation. I've worked for a number of large corporations and even state governments. And I'll tell you, the one axiom that holds true across all of them is when there's a merger and acquisition of a large corporation, or 2 large corporations, I should say, they will never, ever touch a business unit that is wholly profitable. If it's making cash, it gets a pass. It just does. I've seen that over and over again. Even if it's a tiny business unit, if it's making money, meaning it's profitable, not just revenue, I'm talking profit, meaning they're bringing in more money than they're putting out, the large corporation will not touch it. So what's Jim Lee is confirming here is that DC Comics was not profitable. It was not making money. And so it positioned itself to be cut. AT&T did the cuts, but DC Comics had positioned itself to be cut because it wasn't profitable. So let's go over to this ICV2 article and understand a little bit what the point that's being made here that kind of stuck out to me. And I just wanted to see if I could pin that down a little bit, address it, and kind of express my opinion, because it sort of it just didn't make sense from Rob Salkowitz as the author here. It just didn't make sense to me. Or it made sense, but I just didn't agree with it. And I wanted to bring that up. And I want to hear your opinion about this as well. So Rob Salkowitz is essentially reacting or analyzing the Hollywood Reporter article from Jim Lee's interview. And he says this, last week, DC Chief Creative Officer and Publisher Jim Lee, in the Hollywood Reporter article, said that the recent wholesale layoffs and restructuring did not signal that DC was about to go out of the comics publishing business anytime soon. Correct. Setting aside the circumstances to make the question of whether your company is going to continue publishing comics at all a reasonable and timely thing to ask the publisher, Lee's answers to the interview's questions reveal a lot about the new corporate thinking that's about to reshape one of the comics' biggest brands. Now, I'm not going to read the whole article. You can go to ICV2.com. It's there. But this is the piece that Rob Salkowitz kind of put in from his analysis last week, that right after the layoffs, and then he's dovetailing it in here, that sort of stuck out to me. DC's latest reboot, the company itself. It sure looks like DC is doing a major rebalancing of its strategy. Last week, I wrote about how DC and Marvel had squandered most of the century chasing after existing and aging hardcore superhero fans at the expense of providing on-ramps for young readers. So this stuck out to me a little bit. Not that it's necessarily nonsensical in the perspective of, he's not making a point, but it stuck out to me because it seems to me that it's completely backwards from the way DC and potentially Marvel. Stay tuned, kids. I would bet your bottom dollar that Marvel is going to go through a similar streamlining, if I could use the nicest word I can, before the year is out. So I would keep my eyes open for that. It seems he's implying here, and I read through the article that he's linking to as well, that DC's super hyper focused on monthly comics, the mainline 7, if you will, from the JLA, the Batman, Superman's, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, the Flash, Green Lantern, etc., and sort of ignoring the younger, broader demographic of readers. And to me, this doesn't quite ring true. The reason I say that is because if you jump over to DC's blog and look at what's coming up for their graphic novel lines, which the ComicCon numbers from 2019 clearly bear out that the young adult graphic novel numbers are growing huge. There's a lot of traction going on in the young adult graphic novel space. Not all of it is, to be fair, not all of it is centered around the superhero lines, but there definitely is a lot of growth opportunity there. And if I look at what's upcoming, and graphic novels don't get done overnight. In some cases, these take weeks and months to build up. But if I look at what's coming up, you've got Batman Gotham High, which I think has already been out, and that had, shall we say, a mixed reception. Teen Titans, Under the Moon, Catwoman Tale, Wonder Woman Tempest Tossed. I think that one might already be out. Batman Tales Once Upon a Time. A number of different young adult focused graphic novels that take time to build. So to say that DC wasn't focusing on the youth, and these are graphic novels, so some of these are high dollar items, I think does a little bit of disservice to where the focus of DC has been of late when it comes to the young market. On the flip side, if we look at, and we're going to jump over here, there's some of the ComicCon numbers for comic book orders by comics, and this is over the last 3-ish years or so. The white in this graph is all the publishers combined. You can see a very clear downward trend for comic books in sales in North America from all the publishers combined. What this tells me is that DC, especially in recent months and in the last year, is fairly focused on making sure that they put out a decent selection of young adult focused graphic novels. And whatever they're doing in the monthly floppy market, which is probably going to predominantly focus on, or has traditionally focused, I should say, on that, as he puts it, existing and aging hardcore superhero fans, whatever DC was doing, it wasn't working. And so if you're looking down here at the DC graph, which is the red here, it's been fairly flat. There was a little bit of increase around 2016, mid 2016, but overall no steady growth, no significant increases, and Marvel is pretty much the same, although it looks like Marvel is definitely trending down, and is the biggest contributor of the downward trend for the aggregate of publishers combined. So what does that tell me? That tells me that DC has been positioning itself for at least for a few months now, in some cases maybe a year or more, for the YA graphic novel market, which is, those are high dollar products. You don't pick up a graphic novel for $3.99. Those are much more pricey. If you're looking at this list, that's squarely focused on the young adult market. And then whatever was going on in the monthly floppy market, which is that demographic of the existing, aging, and hardcore superhero fans, whatever DC was doing, they were fairly stagnant to flat. And we now know from Jim Lee's numbers that a good percentage of these sales did not make the return on investment that DC was looking for to maintain profitability. So this kind of stuck out to me as an odd statement to make. I can see from a certain perspective how you could jump to this conclusion, but from Jim Lee's comments, from the ComicCon numbers, and from DC's focus on the young adult graphic novel space, this doesn't seem to match up with what's really going on here. If anything, it seems like DC of late has been really focused on attacking that young reader market. The aging, as he puts it, hardcore superhero fan demographic has been left to stagnate, and in some cases maybe even ignored. If you're looking at Jim Lee's numbers of 20 to 25%, whatever they were doing, they definitely weren't catering to that market, because if they were, the sales would be at least even, if not increasing, because as more readers who grew up through the 70s, 80s, 90s, as they get older, they tend to have more disposable income. They have jobs. They have the capacity to spend more money on comic books, and whatever DC was putting out, and I have my opinions, we can reserve that for another video, they definitely weren't capitalizing on it. If anything, it seems like DC had been shifting towards books that don't appeal to that market for whatever reason. That, again, that might be a conversation for another time. But just wanted to kind of throw that out there, that I think what's happened is you have a comics publisher that took its core audience and their core product line, and they just lost their way. They lost their ability to connect the monthly comics with the audience as it exists. Aging, sure, we can go with that. But at the same time, if you look at somebody who is in love with comics, and I grew up in the 70s and 80s, reading all kinds of comic books, Firestorm was one of my favorites. I've got hopefully plenty of decades left in me where I'd be interested in buying comics. But I remember when the New 52 came out, and I saw what they were producing, and it was like, what the heck is this? This is just not appealing. That's just my opinion, but that's just kind of where we are. So whatever DC was planning to do for the existing audience, they either missed the mark wholly, or they were just trying to target to a different audience, and the fish didn't bite the bait. On the flip side of that, they are focusing on the YA graphic novel space, if you look at their lineups coming up here, but maybe it's just a little too late in the game. Remember, the ComicCon numbers that we saw huge gains in the graphic novel space were for last year, and so maybe DC should have jumped on this sooner. But again, it's a different market, and it's a different product. So what do we have? We have a publisher that's sort of split in its strategy as far as what it wants to do. Its established customer base has been, I would say, neglected a bit, wherein the products that they were pumping out just weren't appealing to that base, and so the disconnect there really hurt their bottom line for their core product. And they're just late in the game getting to the graphic novel space for where they are positioned right now. All those things combined, especially when you look at you have a 20 to 25% loss on the monthly comics, you put all those things together, you have a business unit that doesn't know what it's trying to do, doesn't have a solid handle on how it can achieve profitability and stay there. And then you have a large, soulless, faceless mega corporation that comes in and says, yeah, your IPs are valuable, the product that you're producing is not. And so, yeah, when you look at it from that perspective, DC kind of was the master of its own fate, if you want to look at it that way. Things can change. Things can turn around. The publishing arm of DC hasn't been shuttered, but it's definitely taken a hit. And it may not be the last one. Does that mean it's lights out for DC Comics? No, I don't think so. At least not yet. But they've got to right the ship really quickly, or they're going to be in 2021 is going to be, if you thought 2020 was bad, 2021 for DC Comics is not going to be pretty. So let me know what you think. Do you agree with my analysis? Do you agree with my opinion on this? This is Comical Opinions, so I'm giving you my opinion. From my point of view, DC Comics kind of put itself in the position to be targeted, and that's kind of the way it is when it comes to big business. You have to maintain profitability. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you agree. Also, let me know if you disagree. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I'm going to see if I can put out a video at least once a day, every day, 5 days a week. See if I can put something out that's interesting, maybe a unique perspective that you hadn't heard before. But let me know what you think. Let me know if you disagree. Let me know if you agree. Don't forget to give me a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit that little bell for notification. This is Gabe Hernandez, and this is Comical Opinions.